that particular, grade, which with average operators, meaning at a particular sort of productivity of land with a average operator or cultivator, barely remunerates its cultivation. Meaning, in today's wording, we mean, does this break even, right? That's the way I look at it. Remunerate means to pay back, right? To pay for your services. So we want to look at this as a fact of, can we cultivate the crop and does it break even? So if we use this moving forward and the idea of marginal lands, I kind of want to use that as the focus of our thoughts here. If we look at available land and on that marginal side, and I'm going to kind of key in on West Virginia here, just because that's where I'm sitting. If we look at various types of available land right now, we might see areas in annual agriculture, those that are in row crops, whether it be corn, soybean. We might see areas in perennial agriculture. This might be alfalfa and hay. We also might look at former mine lands. These are areas that are, a lot of times associated with this marginal area of economics, right, for development of crops, right, bioenergy crops. There might be some others as well. People might look at the forested areas that you might be able to go in and do silviculture or management in such a way that you could, focus more on bioenergy versus what you would traditional forest crops, managing for large timber. So we could look at these various available land types and how much is out there, what's available. So the first thing in thinking about economics and for West Virginia, let's look at some of those West Virginia marginal estimates, right? So if you look at the little the picture here I have is actually a pretty good photo of an area in West Virginia. You've got obviously some row crop agriculture going on right beside some alfalfa, right? So what are some of those production economics? So if we look at West Virginia, on the little table to the right, you can see that corn is somewhere around 144 bushels to the acre, right? So average prices for corn establishment, according to USDA in 2020, was somewhere around $450 an acre to establish. This does not include like rents for the land. So somewhere around 450 acre to establish and about $720 at that 144 bushels per acre per year value. So obviously in this standpoint, just a real quick calculation, it doesn't appear to us that that corn row type agriculture is going to make that marginal status very easily, right? So it's paying for itself pretty easily, and at very low numbers. If you're aware of corn yields, 144 bushels per acre is quite low, but it's actually quite high probably for West Virginia average, even though that's what's reported. Go to hay lands, hay around 1.9 tons to the acre, excluding alfalfa, maybe with alfalfa up to almost 3 tons per acre, right? So prices there anywhere from $117 to almost $200 a ton. Hay on average, you might be looking at the first year about $300 to establish. This again does not include the land costs. So you're looking at $240 an acre per year value. So after a year and a half, you would be paying for that upfront investment. So you remunerate yourself fairly quickly on this. So let's move on to the next class of marginal lands that we've identified for West Virginia. And this would be on the side of surface mine sites. And again, I'm going to pick on West Virginia and look at our state here. In essence, based on some of the most recent data on surface mining permits, those mines that have either been retired or had their bonds released have been reclaimed, and also those that they're in active production, and also sites that might have had their bonds revoked or they forfeited their bonds and are left up to the state and taxpayer to reclaim. So if we can look at this, approximately 289,000 acres spread across the state. These are obviously large dots used on the map, but there's a general area of those. In 2016, this included roughly 30,000 acres of barren, what we consider barren. So this is going to be, cover that doesn't have good vegetation established. Around 77,000 acres in grassland, and this is multiple classes, whether it be mine grasses, and it could be coming, more of a perennial grass into a shrub type ecotype. And then we have over 176,000 acres in these permit areas that are in forests. So these are areas that perhaps were not originally mined as part of that service mine at the beginning, or perhaps these are areas that over the years, from the 70s on, have those ecosystems have changed and gone through a transformation from the original grasslands up through a forest. We do have that in many areas in our state on these mine lands. So we've seen some of those ecosystem changes, right? So let's just look at the period from 1992 to 2016. A roughly 20-year, a little over 20-year period. So if we look at the 2016 classification versus the 1992, and look at some of these various transformation land cover proportions, and this is based on 30-meter data. If we look at transitional type habitats, this is sort of the transitional between barren and grassland. If we look at developed, forested, and also grassland, all of these increased during this time period in our state based on those 289,000 acres. So we saw increases in these. And one of the big things here is to see is we're starting to see more and more transitional habitat. That transitional habitat is, again, sort of in between the barren and mine grasses, and more of what we would call the forested uplands. And we're starting to see an increase in these forested uplands. At the same time, we've seen a corresponding where do we get this increase in these cover types? Well, we've seen a decrease in barren lands. Okay, so this is based again on 30-meter widely available NLCD data. We can see those changes. If we look at 1-meter data based on USDA NAPE imagery, it kind of tells a similar story. And these are based on land cover classifications done by folks in our Natural Resource Analysis Center. Actually, one of my graduate students is working on these now. But you can see that barren acreage, according to 1-meter data, which is a finer resolution, has declined almost 28%. And grass and forested has increased in 6%. So sort of the method to my madness here is to say that we do have a large contingent of marginal lands available, but a lot of these are starting to go from that barren and grassland and starting to mature and go into other cover types. And if we actually look at these, some work that we did approximately 5 or 6 years ago, we actually looked at these sites and said, okay, of this 280,000 acres that's available in West Virginia, how much of this would actually be available for a short rotation woody crop, meaning it's in grassland now. It has a reasonable slope, say slopes are well under 10%. And we found of that total area, there was only roughly about 30 to 50,000 acres that were actually available for this sort of work. So, and then you further be constrained with those on, the location of those sites, whether or not they'd be close to potential markets and, that side of the ballgame. So, as you can see from this, West Virginia, has a long history of energy production from these surface mine sites. And, it kind of, for us, it highlights some of the history of this energy production. So what I wanted to try to do is frame this too is, West Virginia is not alone, and it's sort of not completely, our burden to pay, right? So I'm not sure, Dan, do we have like interaction available or just via the question and answer?
Well, we can interact if that's helpful for you.
Well, I just want to, I wonder how many folks, are familiar with this diagram and know the name of this diagram. I'll send a WVU hat to the first person that answers it. How about that? WVU swag.
Right. If you know the answer, go ahead and stick your hand, use the button to.
Either that or just put it in the chat.
Yep, yep.
All right, we don't have any interaction.
No,
That's
what
all
if
right.
you know the answer, but you don't want a West Virginia University hat?
Maybe that's the, I should just call on somebody. That's what I have to do in class. So in any event, yeah, Sankey diagram showing energy flow in the United States. This is 2020. So obviously on the left side, we can see some of those energy sources, and coal still makes up, 9.2 quadrillion BTUs of that energy mix, right? That energy flowing through from production through consumption, and obviously a big part of that coal energy being rejected. And this number is down significantly over the last 5 or 6 years. But it's interesting to note for a state like West Virginia that, in terms of energy production, we are the number 5 state in terms of total energy production. But on this, we are number 5 in terms of total energy production. I'm any guess, Dan, where Pennsylvania is? Dan's the only one I know that's kind of.
How about number 3?
Pennsylvania is number 2 in terms of total energy production. But if you think about this even farther and look at that production on the side of the sources, and we go to the right to the consumption in West Virginia only consumes about 20% of the energy that it produces. So a lot of this energy that we're producing in West Virginia is exported out of state, right? And a lot of that energy that we export out of state does go to Pennsylvania, it goes to New Jersey, it goes to Maryland, it goes into the PJM grid. So a lot of the, a lot of the mine sites and the legacy of mining in West Virginia is really not only an East, Mid-Atlantic issue, but a United States issue and also a global issue. So, with that being said, we should look at it this way and look moving forward at ways to, to help use these lands, right? So let's go ahead and look at these surface mine lands in West Virginia.
So
go
Shawn,
ahead.
Before you advance that slide,
Mhm.
since you're asking for interaction, we've had a question pop up about that Sankey diagram and asking what does that term rejected energy, that gray box in the upper right-hand corner, what does that refer to?
Right, that's a great question, and thanks. I think Matt's on there. Rejected energy is just that. That's basically, that's the percentage of the energy that we produce that actually goes into an energy service. So if you think of your car, the petroleum transportation sector is one of the largest, the second largest, consumptive source behind electricity generation, about 24 quads. If you think of your car, as you drive down the road, if you're driving a gasoline powered car, how much of that energy actually goes into propelling the vehicle versus how much of that is lost through heat, lost through friction, lost through those sorts of energy sinks. So one of the solutions to that obviously is to make cars more efficient. One of the things you could do is change the fuel source. You might make a car lighter to cut down on some of that rejected energy, but that's kind of where we are with that. Electricity generation, especially from the coal side, is very inefficient. Those efficiency rates have slowly grown, but still, the amount of energy that's created from the power that's created from the original energy source is a lot smaller than you would expect. So, Dan, does that help?
Yes,
Matt?
thank you very much.
All right, great. So let's go ahead and keep moving on to and go back and frame that thought on these marginal lands, right? So back to Peterson, the general margin of cultivation for a given area is that a particular grade, which with average operators barely remunerates its cultivation. So what about a service mine site? And you can see one here on this, the photo to the right. This is an active site that we worked on a few years ago that we planted some biomass crops on. So obviously right away you see, some large rocks, some pretty difficult soil conditions. Like, what does it cost to just get to the point where we're preparing this to cultivate the crop and then have it break even? So anybody have any guess that can throw out there cost per acre to do this? No one's going to guess. All right, so let's move ahead. Let's look. So we've done a number of these. I've been actively involved in, working through these. Oh, Rick, thank you. $1,000 an acre. Well, that's a pretty good guess. Typically around $1,000 an acre is where we start with the actual feedstocks. Maybe willow we used to be able to get for like 15 to 20 cents per stake. We're upwards of 50 to 60 cents now. If we're planting trees, we're talking upwards with mortality, 1,000 trees per acre to end up maybe between 400 to 700 trees. If those are $1 a piece, so do the math. That feedstock costs are going to be really high. Site prep, these can run as high as $2,000 an acre. Amendments to do this around $250 an acre, depending on what we have, whether or not we're going to have to lime and fertilize. The actual planting all depends. As you can see in this one, unfortunately, some of our graduate students and undergraduate students were involved in the planning of this 4-acre site. So that planting was particularly cost effective, but that's not always the case. And just so you know, I was there also. I had developed quite the blister on my hand at the end of this day. We planted, like I said, 4 acres, roughly 16,000 stems in a day for a group of us. So it was quite the planning. So it came up with a total of $3,100 an acre, right? So at $3,000 an acre, even around that, where do our yields need to be on a short rotation woody crop or on marginal land? One of the ones that we look at are willow plantations. Willow seems to do really well on some sites. It grows particularly high yields. It is relatively easy to plant and to harvest. It's one of those crops that we've looked at quite heavily. So some of the recent literature, I have references all in the back of this, but one recent Fabio 2017, somewhere around 7 to 8, basically tons per hectare per year on some sites, right? So 7 to 8 megagrams per hectare a year on some sites, right? So if you look at this paper, though, part of the methodology, if you look at these numbers, we saw conventional tillage was used to prepare the sites in either the fall or spring prior to planting, which generally occur between May and June. So if we look at a lot of these sites, though, we go back to this picture, you can see in this site that potential conventional tillage is not an option, right, for these sort of crops. So it's very difficult. In this study, they saw upwards of 8 tons per hectare per year at this point, which roughly was coming back at 175 per acre per year. This is based on, I just did the math back of the envelope. This would be based on $50 per oven dried ton is where we would come up with this. So those costs would come back. That would know where even at that level, it would really have a hard time paying for my 3,000, even if I could half that at $1,500 per acre, right? So, what do you expect some of these yields are? And that's part of the side of this that we, coming into it, we weren't quite sure. We know what a lot of traditional hardwood forest yields are like. We've worked with some hybrid poplar in the past, but we hadn't really worked with willow. So we have over the last few years done some work and looked at some of these willow production economics on surface mine sites. So one of the first one done by graduate student Heather Nobert, we found basically in the first year, remember what we were at before, 5, 6 to 8 megagrams per hectare per year. Our first study in the first year of this one was right around 0.1 megagrams per hectare per year, right? This study was done, it was a replicated study on 6 separate mine sites. We also include sort of a reference site, which was a row agriculture site. Interestingly enough, our research showed that the mine sites did about the same as the agricultural sites over the first couple of years. And part of that, we felt like, some of the agriculture sites that we were working on had really depleted soils that were pretty much matched up with what we were working on the surface mine site. So there really wasn't any benefit where we were doing this study to the ag sites. One thing we did notice, and kind of just a star on this, that we used biochar in the study, and it actually improved yields on the mine sites. Another surface mine site where we had used some willow. So this was located in northern West Virginia. After the second year, our yields actually increased to 0.2 tons per hectare per year, or 0.2 megagrams per hectare per year. We did notice some differences in survival with different species. In this one, actually, we tried some different ways of planting the willow in the surface mines. One way, a vertical, another a horizontal type of planting. We found that the traditional vertical planting, the mortality was much less on these. So actually, after 2 years, survival was decent, somewhere around second year survival, anywhere from about 40% upwards to about 80% survival for the different clones. All right, so moving on this same study, you can see to the right, this actual picture of this site coming into. So it was actually a pretty decent site as far as surface mine lands. We had the opportunity to come into this early during the initial reclamation, so we had a little bit better hand in this. We're able to actually, some of this was limed and fertilized, so that 0.2 megagrams per hectare per year was actually with a liming and fertilization on this site. So some of the better conditions that we would see. Our yield measurements were early, only after 2 years, but usually into the third years when we would get our first cutting for the willow. We were significantly less than those break-even costs that we needed to have, right? Significantly less. Even at higher yields, say we could get that 8 megagrams per hectare per year that we found in some of the conventional tillage areas, we would be more than 5 years before we would be paid back. So sort of interesting looking at some of these sites and those paybacks for the crops on the surface mine sites. All right, so I think last week, Dr. Skousen was speaking, and he probably told you that switchgrass was the answer to all of our problems. Which is interesting. So in light of some of the recent research has come out, some of the more perennial grasses with the limited management might be one of the ways we go. But if you look at yields on these, switchgrass yields, some of the lower sites, if you remember from Jeff's presentation, we're probably around the 1.5 or so tons per acre, upwards to about 5 tons per acre on an average site. The best site that he had, I believe, was somewhere around 10 to 15 tons per acre, which, sites like that would do. But in that 1.5 to 2 tons per acre on some of these surface mine sites, we're going to have a really, really hard time making paybacks. Now, if they were traditional ag sites with pasture land where the cultivation is a lot cheaper, you might be able to do it. But on these sites, that cultivation is sort of the killer. So that site prep. Right, so that leads us into mass bio. Obviously, you guys are familiar with this. So some of the overarching goals is to deliver this sustainable and economically feasible. And I want to really cue in on the economics, the feasible side of this, and really work to look at this and how we kind of look outside the box on some of these sites, right? So in our kind of task for the whole mass bio is all the way on the right, and it's engaging with entrepreneurs, stakeholders, and business developers. Look at ways to make these sites more productive, perhaps to make them better, as far as sustainability for environmental concerns, and also for the companies for the bottom line. Like what are some of the ways that we can, not only for the companies, but for our governments to, to reclaim some of these sites? What are some of the ways that we can do this on that right side of the spectrum? So engaging with the folks that have these lands, right? So what do? We might want to look more at this. We might want to look a little bit more on this ecosystem service component. Where can we go on this ecosystem service? Maybe more of a focus on these marginal lands, more of a focus on just reforestation versus bioenergy production, like an agroforestry, and soil carbon, right? And perhaps to look at developing more of these carbon negative systems, during the restoration of these sites. So a little background, if we look at a recent publication in Nature by Poston et al., we can look at on the right, so the big part of this, do we have any degraded or marginal land, kind of this decision flow chart? Well, what's the first thing we need to do with this? What's the best mitigation practice? Well, the first thing is convert to a perennial vegetation. And we've looked at some of that West Virginia service mine data, and this is kind of happening a little bit naturally, right? And some of these areas that are barren and moving through time, they're moving into a transitional state into grasslands and into eventually shrub and forest lands, right? So that's kind of happening. How can we enhance this? If we look at the graphic below, right? So some of the things that we can do that would fit right into our bioenergy work or marginal land work, right? One of the things is the influence of biochar in land restoration. We might even couple that with some organic amendments, and these might be organic amendments from the compost side that would cut down on carbon or CO2 emissions that could be mixed with biochar and used in some of these land restoration settings. So if we continue on this path, also out of Poston, and I have this reference at the end, so it's a really great paper. We can kind of look at, what are our reduction, our average greenhouse gas emission reduction, sort of on a scale here. What are we getting from different types of practices, and how much adoption, right? Are we getting to the right? So we can potentially get, on this scale, implementing those greenhouse gas reduction, restoring degraded lands is one of those practices that that represents a significant portion of land, and also can significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions, right? We can also use biochar applications over large areas of lands, and potentially not reduce or remove CO2 emissions, but still have an impact, right? But if we combine the two, perhaps that is an area that we should discuss. Obviously, implementing these soil greenhouse gas reductions or reforestation, there's 4 ways to look at that. And that's through a regulation and taxation. We can look at subsidies, we can look at supply chain initiatives, and we can look at cap and trade. And today we're going to kind of look at sort of supply chain and cap and trade, 2 different projects that work sort of in these areas. If we move on to that biochar and soil, and from the left, this is in a sugarcane agricultural setting, published in 2020. We'll just kind of look at the left that reduces, that has zero priming or zero influence of the soil microbes enhancement from biochar. But if we add biochar over time, obviously in pink is we're adding biochar, a full biochar production and application over the lifetime of these crops, and we get our biggest bang for the buck in carbon stock sequestration right in the soil. Also, in a meta-analysis that was just published a few years ago, found that biochar from crop residue obviously increased soil organics stock. This was over a number of 12 different studies that have been done. The big finding here is the sequestration of carbon more pronounced where the crop residues were converted to biochar. And I think Dr. Skassen spoke about this last week when he was talking about some of the corn stover and those, leaving those residues on the site or removing them for, I think he was talking about ethanol production. So in this case, we're talking about, gathering those residues, converting those to biochar, and then depositing those back into the soil as a carbon source, right? So, just various studies that have been published on the nature of that biochar and how it affects that soil C. And just recently in Nature, kind of interesting too, that leads right into the surface mine work, through Terra et al. In 2019, found that this is another meta-analysis. Basically, as atmospheric CO2 emissions rise, the thought pattern was that above ground biomass would also rise to keep up with that, and we'd also see carbon storage in the soil increase. But actually, what was happening, they found that C in the soil was actually declining due to increase in microbial activity. And that doubling of CO2 did not have the immediate response to vegetation what they thought it would, right? The doubling of CO2 almost found an increase in vegetation growth of about 12%. So from this, grasslands may absorb proportionally more C. So managing towards more of these grasslands, and on these surface mine sites, potentially, more of the transitional cover is where this management could benefit us the most. So going with that, I want to look at some of the restoration work and biochar work that we've begun in New Bio, and some of the preliminary site results that we've seen. Right, so the first new project in 2021 was started through our stream restoration project. This one was led by a graduate student of mine, Shawn Anderson. We're looking at incorporating biochar as a soil amendment and tree planting. We basically had a mitigation site that was a former surface mine site that had a stream that was in pretty poor shape since the original retirement of the service mine. We had other energy operators that were looking for areas to mitigate based on some of the development they were doing. And this site was selected and chosen for this restoration by All Star Ecology. They are developing the site. They will then sell those mitigation or offset credits and mitigation credits to the company needed them, right? So for this one, they were going to do this with reforest this with trees as part of this. We wanted to look at the addition of biochar in this to see how this would impact growth of these trees over the long term, right? So more of a really focused project looking at individual trees versus over a larger bioenergy crop development, right? So we had about 6,000 feet of stream completed in 2021. We'll be continuing on with this in 2022. The site, as you can see, this is part of it. This is in Lewis County, West Virginia. You can see the stream sort of meandering down through the valley. This is right after restoration of the site. That stream used to be a straight shot. It was kind of packed up against the right-hand side of that bank. Channelized stream design. The stream was recontoured. Obviously the extent of the stream changed, the stream banks were changed to give us more linear footage of stream, moved it from a channelized situation into this. Trees were planted, almost 2,000 trees planted within this restoration site, right? Various types of habitat and other development, right? After service mining site, it's kind of interesting. This was also a former cattle operation. So from surface, it went to cattle, and then now into a restored, perpetually protected, restored wetland. Right. So during the spring of 2021, we had 1,849 trees were included in the restoration study. They were planted in both a bottomland, what we call a bottomland depressional forest, as well as an upland forest. So some of the upper reaches on this, we also planted. 7 different tree species were used in each of those restored areas. And we included 3 treatments on this. We had a reference where we did nothing. We just planted the trees. We had a 50% biochar and 50% compost mix, and a 10% biochar and a 10% compost mix. Our amendment rates for this project were at basically 4.5 and 22 tons per acre. So two wide ranges in char application rates. each of the trees, every tree in the study, 1,800 trees were tagged, caged, and protected with a weed map. So you can see one of the trees here in this study. That's actually a shrub, a red osier dogwood that was used in the study. You can see it there in the picture. So a lot of intensity into this. Hopefully, everyone will know why we cage the trees, right? So. First growing results, what we're like after. So these were planted in the spring. We finished up before March of spring of 2021. Result wise, we had really good success on this site. Our mortality averaged roughly around 2%. Did not vary much with the biochar treatments. We did have a little bit higher in a 50% biochar, but it was very close to the reference. We had a group of, because this is for mitigation credit, the All-Star Ecology went back through the site this spring, identified all the mortality, and or in the fall identified all mortality and are replanting those that mortality this spring. So those will be replanted. We'll get, from that we'll get a kind of idea of potentially the actual site of that mortality might have more to do than the treatment that we used. All right. Another project that we started in 2021 was more of what I would consider more of a cap and trade sort of project, and it really was a great project as far as the outreach and to companies in our region and kind of looking at these potential on their lands. Tara Knox, one of my master's students, worked on this last year and also worked with a large natural gas midstream company. Looking at the feasibility of offsetting the emissions of a midstream facility and basically moving natural gas and natural gas liquids from point A to point B. You have a number of, not only do you have an infrastructure of pipeline, but you also have an infrastructure of compressor stations to move the gas, and also stations that remove some of the contaminants and also some of the liquids from that gas. So, we worked with this company that owned a lot of acreage in the area, and they were interested in looking at mitigating some of their emissions from their plant. So Tara was able to incorporate biochar as a soil amendment, and she basically did this all on her own, interested in growth potential and carbon sequestration on these sites. And we also partnered with the RES, Resource Environmental Solutions, was able to partner with us and work with us on some of the planting of the trees for these sites, right? So there's an example of a compressor station in Marshall County. That's where we were working at, basically Marcellus midstream infrastructure sites. Were not being identified just because of the ask of the company. So site 1 was a site that the land was privately owned, and sites 2 and 3 were owned by the company. The privately owned site was owned by the company, but the actual site that they were using was being leased. So Tara had to work with the actual landowner on this site. So as part of this project, Tara was able to get 200 trees included in this project. Planted in both, again, a bottomland sort of depressional and an upland forest, a lot more in the upland forest habitat type here. And Terry was able to use 5 tree species in each of the restored areas. So kind of an interesting duplication of the other project, but in a totally different situation. These sites are not service mine sites in the fact that they were service mines, but they were part of the energy development and had, originally may have been pasture or may have been treed, and now we're being restored back to grasslands. Again, we had the same 3 treatments, a reference of 50% biochar and 50% compost, and a 10% biochar and 10% biochar and 90% compost. Sorry, that's what that should say. So again, the same amendment rates, 4.5 and 22 tons per acre. Trees in this study were tagged in tubes, so we did not use cages. In this one, we used tree tubes. So first year growing results, we did see, a little bit of difference in diameter growth between the trees. We had really good survival, 100% survival of the trees this year, which is amazing in any of these studies. And we did see a diameter growth in all of the different treatments in the reference. However, none of those differences were significant when looking at relative diameter. However, in height growth, we did see a difference. We saw a significantly lower relative height growth in the first year. So in some of our species. So some of the biochar treatments, when we used the highest treatment, which was roughly at 22 tons per acre, we saw significantly lower relative height growth. And it'll be interesting to see over time whether that continues or whether it was just a first year. So a big part of this was Tara. This is actually a company that she's employed by, and she did a great job of working with the company to get them interested in looking at kind of reducing some of their emissions. She found at the end of her project and all the work that she put in that the biochar added, basically 12 kilograms of CO2 equivalent units for that, application, how she applied it. Total offset was right around 1.2 megatons per year, or megagrams per year. And when she calculated it out based on the real numbers of the plant that she was working at, she was running around 0.0085% of the plant's emissions offset. So, really interesting, and it really, led us down that path of, what would it take? And at this point, just for the trees without sort of the biochar, because realized the biochar was only, to get those equivalencies, we only were adding like cups of biochar in a voluminous form. So, the amount of biochar being added was very small, but over a landscape level, we get a lot more input from this. Right. So just from the tree side, roughly 300 acres to get 10% of the emissions output. So we'd have to retire 300 acres planting trees to get 10% of the emissions for that year. And that would be included over time. Okay. And so finally, additional work that we have going on this, we're also working with RES and look at some of the ways, when we did these individual tree studies, we were basically adding the biochar to the tree during the planting, which adds a kind of a level of complexity to that planting process. We're able to partner with RES and start a small nursery study where RES is an environmental restoration company that works on developing these mitigation sites. So one of the things that they've done is create a nursery to upsize some of their seedlings, so they can take a seedling and get it into larger age classes in the nursery and then plant instead of planting all younger trees. So we were able to work with them on doing some biochar additions in the nursery to the actual potting mixes, and we wanted to look at in a nursery setting, how this impacts the tree growth. So we did 30 basically 1-year-old, 3 species, 2 treatments, so over 180 trees. And also we did 30 3-year-old upsize 3 trees. So 200 trees each in each of these nursery studies. Those went in last spring, and we'll do our first rounds of measurement this year as those trees grow in their second year. All right. So Dan, how am I doing? We've got time.
Doing great. You got maybe another 5 minutes?
Yep, that's all I have. Great. Great. So momentum, moving into this, right? So if we look at some of the carbon offsite, obviously there's a lot of opportunities in this side. Currently it seems recently the Senate passed, I think it was in June, passed the Growing Climate Solutions Act of 2021. And this was part of that whole area of soil carbon, being able to incentivize landowners to participate in carbon markets, authorize the USDA to do this work. It didn't really give any standards for accounting, but gave the USDA kind of those third-party certification audits, gave the USDA third-party certification rights. So we've seen this. This has been, like I said, it was passed by the Senate by a majority back in June, but it's kind of not gone anywhere since. At this point, I think most of the people that have looked at this see a very, very low likelihood of this passing. But just knowing that, in recent just in the last month or so, we've seen a number of different acts that have been brought toward our attention that are being developed right now that are related to reforestation and storing carbon in these reforestation practices and also in the soil. And so part of this moving forward with all of this activity that's going on, I really want everyone to think about sort of those, questions from that side. This remuneration on marginal lands, getting our money back in West Virginia. What is our best way to get there? Like, how do we do this? And maybe the second part of this question is do we need to get there? Is this something that we really need to get to, or do we go back to those original analyses of cover type change over time, like what it's doing on itself and versus cost of inputs, like where's the balancing line there? And I'd love to hear some of everyone's thoughts on biomass production, versus this targeted restoration. Where in the future might our best bang for our buck be? In West Virginia, in other areas that have these certain, similar characteristics. As you see, this picture on the side is a former mine site with a channelized stream. These are the areas that I'm talking about that we would be working on. And finally, could carbon and CO2 equivalencies be used as a funding revenue source for this restoration? How do we take this one step further and make this carbon negative? And perhaps some of the speakers that you'll have in the future may talk about some of this. I know they're going to be talking about the traditional harvesting residues, and are there opportunities to use some of those residues on some of these restored lands, moving those right from a pyrolyzed carbon product right into the ground, and will that help us get to that carbon negativity versus those products decomposing naturally, or perhaps potentially making it into other waste streams? So those are some of the questions I leave you with. I by no means don't have the answers, but I'd love to hear what you have to say. And finally, the references throughout the talk, all of the different projects that I referenced, and where the literature resides. So, okay.
All right, terrific. Thanks so much, Dr. Grushecky. We have time for maybe one or two questions before we finish up. So if anyone has a question here in the room or online, we have one here from Karen. And she's saying that this restoration plan is great, but focusing these lands into the productive sector gives an opportunity to cover those restoration costs for companies. Is this something? It almost sounded like you said that's not even worth doing, and that you're kind of trying to shift away from that approach for mass bio. Is that correct, or is there a real potential to be looking at these abandoned mine lands as potential producers of profit, rather than looking at them as users of bio-based products in the restoration effort?
Dan, am I still?
You're on.
All right. Yeah, I think both. I think both. I think kind of the key to this is both. You take those lands from and I just pick it on service lands here. We have other marginal lands in the state, but just if you look at those service mine sites, you pick the ones that are most amenable to biomass production, obviously, and use those lands potentially to produce some of the bioenergy crops, or maybe even some of the carbon products that can be used then to offset some of your restoration efforts on some of the lands that are a lot harder to work with, right, Dan? So I think it's kind of an approach that would be on that side. But truthfully, though, if you look at all the acreage, then if you get down to brass tacks and look at the available acreage and what you can actually produce in tonnages on some of these lands, it's going to take a revolution in crops. It's going to take a revolution in production efficiencies. It's going to take a revolution in those establishment costs to really get us to where we need to be. I'm not saying it's not important, but it's something that, right now, some of that focus, I think, should be directed to some of these potential markets. And I love the Karen's ideas here. looking at some of these is, as you develop these more and more companies are doing this, looking at the development of these impacted lands, and restoring them and then putting a price on that for either rent or for perpetual protection, right? So, I think that's going to be a trend that we'll continue to see. Hopefully that
Terrific.
sorted out there.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Shawn. I think we're pretty much out of time now, so I would encourage people, if they have questions or follow-ups for Dr. Grushecky, you can see his email address on the screen there. Please feel free to touch base with him. And once again, Dr. Grushecky, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. And for everyone, we look forward to seeing you at next week's seminar. Thank you very much.